Under the eerie glow of a lone streetlight in a quiet Ohio town, a black SUV glided through the night, its driver unaware that she was seconds away from a trap that would unravel a web of corruption. Lena Harris, a seasoned CIA operative, gripped the wheel with steady hands, her sharp eyes scanning the deserted streets of Dayton. It was well past midnight, and the city was cloaked in silence, broken only by the faint hum of a distant car or the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. Lena was wrapping up a covert mission in this unassuming town, her mind already drifting to her next assignment. But tonight, two crooked cops were about to drag her into a dangerous game, one they'd lived to regret. Lena eased her SUV to a stop at a quiet intersection, her instincts honed from years in the field. She paused at the stop sign, her headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. Everything felt routine, almost too calm, until a sudden burst of red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror. The shrill wail of a siren pierced the stillness, slicing through the night like a warning. Lena's pulse stayed steady. She was built for moments like this. Her mind sharpened, every detail snapping into focus. She glanced in the mirror, watching a police cruiser pull up behind her, its headlights glaring like the eyes of a predator. With measured calm, Lena pulled her SUV to the curb, turned off the engine, and reached for her license and registration in the glove compartment. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their silhouettes stark against the flashing lights. The taller one, Officer Derek Walsh, strode forward with an air of authority, his jaw tight and his gait deliberate. His partner, Officer Paul Hogan, shorter and stockier, trailed behind, his hand resting casually on his belt. Their navy blue uniforms bore the Dayton Police Department's insignia, their badges catching the streetlight's glow. "Good evening, ma'am," Walsh said, his voice sharp and commanding, as he leaned toward her window. He swept his flashlight across her face, the beam harsh against her dark eyes. "You know why we pulled you over tonight?" Lena met his gaze, her expression neutral but unwavering. "No, officer," she replied evenly. "I wasn't speeding, and I stopped fully at the sign back there." Walsh's lips twitched into a faint, condescending smirk. "Actually, you rolled through that stop sign," he said, his tone laced with certainty. "That's a violation." Lena's brow furrowed slightly, but she held her composure. "I'm certain I stopped, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "There must be a mistake." "License and registration," Walsh snapped, his tone growing colder, dismissing her words. Lena handed over her documents, her movements slow and deliberate to avoid escalating the situation. Walsh scanned her license, his eyes lingering as he noted her Ohio address and local plates. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice probing. "Yes," Lena replied simply, her gaze steady. Hogan, who had been circling her SUV, suddenly called out, "Hey, Walsh, come check this out." His voice carried a theatrical edge, and Lena's jaw tightened as she watched him through her side mirror. He was pointing at something in her trunk, his posture smug. Walsh handed her documents back without a word. "Stay in the car," he ordered before joining Hogan at the rear of her vehicle. Lena's instincts flared, a flicker of unease rippling through her chest. Not fear. Lena Harris didn't scare easily, but something was off. She caught the officers exchanging glances, their voices low and conspiratorial. Moments later, Walsh returned, his face now grim, his eyes glinting with something dark. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Lena tilted her head slightly, her voice still calm. "May I ask why, officer?" "We've got reason to believe you're carrying illegal substances," Walsh said, his words clipped, almost rehearsed. Lena's eyes narrowed, but she kept her cool. "Illegal substances," she repeated, her tone edged with skepticism. "You're mistaken." "We'll see about that," Walsh shot back, gesturing for her to exit. Hogan was already at her trunk, lifting it with a dramatic flourish. He pointed to a small, unmarked bag sitting conspicuously near the edge. "Well, look at this," Hogan said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "A bag of something powdery. Wonder what it could be." Lena's gaze flicked to the bag, then back to the officers, her face unreadable. Her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. That bag wasn't there when she'd left her safe house. She'd stake her life on it. This was a setup, plain and simple. Walsh stepped closer, his smirk widening. "Anything you want to tell us, ma'am?" Lena's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. a calculated expression that held no fear, only quiet defiance. "I'll save my comments for the right time," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made Hogan's grin falter for a split second. Walsh chuckled, mistaking her calm for arrogance. "Oh, you'll get your chance. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." As Hogan moved to cuff her, Lena didn't resist, her gaze steady and piercing. "You're making a big mistake," she said softly, her words laced with an intensity that sent a shiver through Hogan's spine. He snapped the cuffs into place, but her eyes never left his. "Yeah, we'll see how tough you are in front of a judge," Walsh said, leading her toward the cruiser. As they drove away, Lena stared out the window, the city lights blurring past. Her mind was already spinning, plotting her next move. Walsh and Hogan thought they'd scored an easy win, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. They just picked a fight with a woman who could bring their whole world crashing down. The cold steel of the handcuffs still lingered on Lena Harris's wrists as she sat in the back of the Dayton police cruiser, the city lights fading into a blur of regret for officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan. They thought they'd trapped an easy mark, framing her with a bag of drugs that didn't belong to her. But Lena, a CIA operative with nerves of steel, was already 3 steps ahead, her mind dissecting their every move from the moment they'd pulled her over. As the cruiser rolled into the Dayton Police Department's lot, she knew this was no ordinary arrest. It was a calculated strike, and she was ready to turn their game against them. The station was a dimly lit maze of scuffed linoleum floors and peeling paint, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Walsh and Hogan led Lena inside, their boots echoing in the quiet of the night shift. The other officers glanced up from their desks, their eyes flickering with mild curiosity. "Caught a live one tonight," Walsh announced, his voice brash, a smug grin spreading across his face. Hogan tossed the planted bag of powder onto the counter with a theatrical flourish. "Found her with this," he said, winking at a colleague. "Guess she's been running more than stop signs." Lena stayed silent, her dark eyes sweeping the room, cataloging every detail. The placement of security cameras, the layout of the desks, the casual camaraderie among the officers. This was a tight-knit station, the kind where secrets were buried deep and loyalty trumped truth. They guided her to a fingerprinting station, where Walsh removed her cuffs and motioned for her to place her hands on the ink pad. She complied without a word, her movements calm and deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. The officer at the station, a young rookie named Ethan Brooks, hesitated as he looked at Lena. There was something about her unshakable calm, her piercing gaze, that didn't fit the profile of a typical suspect. "Name?" he asked, his voice softer than the others, almost apologetic. "Lena Harris," she replied evenly. "Occupation?" Brooks pressed, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Lena paused for a fraction of a second, choosing her words carefully. "Consultant," she said, vague enough to avoid scrutiny, but true enough to skirt a lie. Brooks nodded, typing quickly, his unease evident in the way his eyes darted toward Walsh and Hogan, who were laughing quietly by the counter, basking in their supposed victory. "You got something to say?" Walsh called out, his tone darkening as he caught Lena's steady gaze. She didn't respond, her silence cutting through their bravado like a blade. Hogan's smirk faltered, and he muttered something under his breath before turning away. They led her to a holding cell, a cold, dimly lit box with a metal bench bolted to the wall. The bars cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The door slammed shut with a heavy clang, the sound reverberating through the corridor. Walsh lingered for a moment, studying her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You don't look like the type to get mixed up in this," he said, his voice almost conversational. "But don't worry, the courts love a good sob story. Maybe they'll go easy on you." Lena tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his. "Or maybe they'll see through yours," she said softly, her words carrying an edge that made Walsh shift uncomfortably. He scoffed, muttering something inaudible, and walked away, leaving her alone in the cell. Lena leaned back against the cold metal wall, exhaling slowly. Her mind was a steel trap, replaying every moment of the encounter. The fake stop sign violation, the planted bag, The officer's smug confidence. This wasn't a random act of corruption. It was rehearsed, deliberate. She knew her next steps had to be precise. Hidden in the hem of her jacket was a small tracker, standard issue for CIA operatives. With a subtle movement, she pressed against the fabric, activating the device with a faint click. The signal would reach her team within minutes, and they'd know exactly where to find her. In the station's break room, Walsh and Hogan sat back with steaming mugs of coffee, their laughter filling the small space. "She thinks she's untouchable," Hogan said, shaking his head. "Did you see her?" Not even a hint of panic. "Yeah, well, that'll change," Walsh replied, a smirk tugging at his lips. "She's just another name in the system now. Nobody's going to dig too deep." "Evidence is airtight," Hogan added, leaning back in his chair. "No witnesses, no questions. Slam dunk." Neither of them noticed Brooks lingering nearby, his face pale, his eyes darting toward the holding cells. Something about Lena's arrest didn't sit right with him. The bag of drugs had been too convenient, the officer's confidence too polished. He'd only been on the job a few months, but he'd been trained to spot patterns, and this felt wrong. He kept his mouth shut, though. Questioning senior officers in a place like this wasn't just risky, it was career suicide. Back in her cell, Lena sat perfectly still, her posture unyielding. The hours ticked by, but she didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Every sound, the footsteps of the night shift officers, the crackle of the radio, the faint beep of the station's computers, was another piece of the puzzle. She was waiting, patient as a predator, knowing her team would come. For now, she played the part of the calm detainee, unremarkable and unthreatening. But inside, she was a storm waiting to break. And when it did, Walsh and Hogan wouldn't know what hit them. As dawn crept through the narrow window of Lena Harris's holding cell, painting faint streaks of light across the cold concrete, the Dayton Police Department buzzed with a tension that hadn't been there the night before. Lena sat motionless on the metal bench, her sharp eyes half closed, but her mind was anything but idle. The tracker she'd activated hours ago, hidden in her jacket, was now a silent beacon calling her CIA team to her side. She could almost feel the gears turning, her colleagues mobilizing in the shadows while officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan reveled in their false victory. Their smug laughter from the break room still echoed in her memory, but Lena knew their confidence was about to crack, and she was ready to pry it open. The station was coming to life, the day shift officers shuffling in with their coffee mugs and tired greetings. Lena listened to the rhythm of their footsteps, the snippets of conversation drifting through the bars. She'd spent the night observing, cataloging the station's routines, waiting for the moment to strike. Her calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to the chaos she was about to unleash. At the front desk, Ethan Brooks, the rookie officer who'd processed her, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. Lena's words from the night before, "Or maybe they'll see through yours," had burrowed into his mind, gnawing at his conscience. Her unshakable composure, the too perfect evidence, the way Walsh and Hogan had gloated. It didn't add up. Brooks glanced at the surveillance monitors, the grainy feed showing Lena sitting still as a statue in her cell. Most detainees fidgeted, cursed, or begged. But Lena? She was patient, almost serene, like she was waiting for something inevitable. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, hesitating. He pulled up her file again, scanning the sparse details. Lena Harris, consultant, local address. The employment history was vague, a red flag that made his stomach twist. Frowning, he minimized the file and stole a glance toward the break room, where Walsh and Hogan were laughing over donuts, their voices carrying through the station. "She's probably sweating it out in there by now," Walsh said, his tone smug as he wiped crumbs from his chin. "They always think they can talk their way out." Hogan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, this one's a slam dunk. Drugs in the trunk. No alibi. She's done." Their laughter grated on Brooks's nerves. Against his better judgment, he opened the digital arrest report for Lena's case, his eyes scanning the details. Stopped for failure to yield at a marked intersection. Driver exhibited nervous behavior. Consent to search granted. Controlled substances found in trunk. It read like a textbook case, but it was too clean, too scripted. Brooks had been trained to spot deception, and this report screamed it. His heart pounded as he realized he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop now. While Walsh and Hogan basked in their arrogance, Lena made her next move. She shifted slightly on the bench, her movements subtle, her eyes flicking to the outdated camera outside her cell. She knew its blind spots, its weaknesses. Years in the field had taught her to exploit systems like this. Her tracker's signal had reached her team, and she trusted them to act with precision. But she also needed to sow doubt here, inside the station. Brooks was the key. She'd seen the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, the crack in his loyalty to the station's unspoken code. All it needed was a nudge. Brooks's unease grew as the morning wore on. He found himself pacing near the holding cells, his boots scuffing the linoleum. Finally, he stopped outside Lena's cell, his hands gripping his belt. "Ms. Harris," he said, his voice low, almost uncertain. Did you really consent to that car search?" Lena looked up, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. She tilted her head, studying him like a chess player sizing up an opponent. "What do you think, Officer Brooks?" she asked, her tone calm but pointed, cutting straight to his doubt. Brooks swallowed hard, his face flushing. "I'm just doing my job," he stammered, but the words felt hollow. "That's what they're counting on," Lena replied, her gaze unwavering. "Men like Walsh and Hogan, they need people like you to look the other way." Brooks stepped back, his breath catching. Her words hit like a punch, stirring the conflict raging inside him. He muttered something incoherent and retreated down the hall, but Lena saw the tension in his shoulders, the seed of doubt taking root. She leaned back against the wall, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The cracks were spreading. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office across town, a phone buzzed softly on a desk. A man in a tailored suit answered, his voice calm but authoritative. "Signal received," he said. "Location confirmed. Deploying resources." In a secure operations room, monitors flickered with live feeds from the Dayton police station. One screen showed Lena in her cell, perfectly composed. Another displayed Brooks at his desk, visibly agitated. "The kid's starting to break," an agent observed. The man nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Good. We'll use it." Back at the station, Walsh leaned back in the break room, sipping his coffee. "You notice Brooks acting off today?" he asked Hogan, his tone casual but edged with suspicion. Hogan shrugged, tossing a donut wrapper into the trash. "Kid's always jumpy. Fresh out of the academy. He'll get over it." "Let's hope so," Walsh said, his eyes narrowing. "Last thing we need is a rookie poking around where he doesn't belong." As the day dragged on, the tension in the station thickened, a silent storm brewing just beneath the surface. Lena could feel it, the subtle shift in the air. Her team was close, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. Brooks was closer to breaking than he realized, and Walsh and Hogan's overconfidence was their downfall. The facade was crumbling, and Lena was ready to bring it all crashing down. If this story's got you hooked, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with more gripping tales like Lena's fight for justice. Your support helps bring these stories to life. The air in the Dayton Police Department crackled with unease, a silent storm that had been brewing since dawn when Ethan Brooks first questioned the arrest of Lena Harris. Locked in her holding cell, Lena sat with the same unshakable calm that had unnerved Brooks hours ago, her dark eyes fixed on the bars as if she could see the chaos unfolding beyond them. The tracker she'd activated had done its job. Her CIA team was closing in, their presence a shadow creeping closer with every tick of the clock. Officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan, oblivious to the net tightening around them, still lounged in the break room, their laughter now tinged with a nervous edge. The cracks Lena had sown in their facade were about to shatter, and the reckoning was here. The station's usual hum of activity, officers typing reports, phones ringing, coffee mugs clinking, fell into an eerie silence as the front doors swung open. Three figures stepped inside, their black suits crisp, their FBI badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The lead agent, a tall man with graying hair and a steely gaze named Agent Michael Carter, strode toward the front desk with quiet authority. His two colleagues flanked him, their expressions unreadable, but their presence commanding. Brooks, seated at his desk, froze mid-keystroke, his heart pounding. He knew deep down that the email he'd sent exposing Walsh and Hogan's suspicious arrest had triggered this. But he hadn't expected the FBI to show up so fast, or so visibly. The desk sergeant, a grizzled veteran named O'Malley, straightened up, his hand instinctively hovering near his radio. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice gruff, eyes narrowing at the agents. "Federal investigation," Carter replied, his tone clipped and unwavering. "We need access to your records and holding cells. Now." O'Malley hesitated, glancing at the other officers who had stopped to watch. The FBI's arrival was a disruption, a breach of the station's unspoken code. But there was no protocol for refusal. "Fine," he muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. "Follow me." Brooks's palms grew slick with sweat as he watched the exchange. His gaze flicked to Walsh and Hogan, who had emerged from the break room, their faces pale, their laughter replaced by hushed whispers. Walsh's eyes locked onto Brooks for a moment, sharp with suspicion, and the rookie quickly looked away, pretending to focus on his screen. The station felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Agent Carter and his team set up in a small interrogation room, a tech agent rolling in a cart loaded with a portable server and hard drives. They plugged into the station's network, their fingers flying across keyboards as they sifted through digital archives. "Anything?" Carter asked, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. The tech agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Ruiz, nodded. "Plenty. Their case files are a mess. Identical narratives, procedural gaps, repeated arrests with the same MO. This isn't sloppy policing, it's a pattern." Carter's jaw tightened. "Pull everything. Every report, every piece of evidence tied to Walsh and Hogan." In her cell, Lena felt the shift in the station's rhythm, the hurried footsteps, the muffled voices, the tension seeping through the walls. She shifted slightly on the bench, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The faint red marks from her cuffs were a reminder of the night before, but they didn't faze her. Her team was here, and the moment she'd been waiting for was unfolding. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, picturing the look on Walsh and Hogan's faces when their world came crashing down. In the break room, Walsh paced, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Hogan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face tight with unease. "You think this is about her?" Hogan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Walsh stopped, glaring at him. "Of course it's about her. Why else would the feds be here?" His voice was sharp, but there was no conviction in it. "They don't know anything. We followed procedure." "Yeah," Hogan muttered, unconvinced. "Sure." Agent Carter emerged from the interrogation room, a folder of printed reports in hand, his expression unreadable. He moved through the station with purpose, his eyes locking onto Walsh and Hogan, who froze mid-conversation. The other agents positioned themselves around the room like sentinels, their presence a silent warning. "Officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan," Carter said, his voice slicing through the air. "We need to speak with you." Walsh forced a smirk, trying to play it cool. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone casual but strained. "We've got nothing to hide." Carter didn't blink. "Good. Then you won't mind answering a few questions." The room fell silent as the agents led Walsh and Hogan toward the interrogation room. Brooks watched, his heart hammering in his chest. He could see the cracks in Walsh's bravado, the tension in Hogan's shoulders. The once confident duo now looked like cornered animals, their arrogance unraveling with every step. Minutes later, another agent approached Lena's cell. The door buzzed open, and the agent stepped inside, his face neutral but his tone respectful. "Ms. Harris," he said, "you're free to go." Lena stood, her movements smooth and deliberate. She met the agent's gaze, nodding slightly as she stepped out of the cell. The hallway felt brighter, the oppressive weight of the station lifting as she walked toward the front desk. As she passed Brooks's desk, their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the words catching in his throat. Lena stopped, turning to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of understanding. Brooks's chest tightened. He gave a small nod, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time since joining the force, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. The interrogation room doors closed behind Walsh and Hogan, and the sound of raised voices soon followed. Lena paused at the station's entrance, watching as the agents began to dismantle the officers' lies. The storm she'd waited for had arrived, and it was only the beginning. The Dayton Police Department was a house of cards, and with the FBI's arrival, it had begun to collapse. Lena Harris stood just outside the station's entrance, the crisp morning air brushing against her face as she watched officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan being led out in handcuffs. Their once smug faces were now grim, their eyes downcast, stripped of the arrogance that had fueled their scheme to frame her. Inside, Agent Michael Carter and his team were dismantling a web of lies, their evidence piling up like kindling for a fire that would burn through the station's corruption. Lena's release from the holding cell had been the spark, and now the reckoning was in full swing, its flames reaching far beyond the walls of the precinct. Inside the cramped interrogation room, Walsh and Hogan sat across from Agent Carter, the metal table between them a cold barrier reflecting their dwindling options. The air was thick with tension, the faint hum of the overhead light amplifying the silence. Carter leaned forward, sliding a series of printed photos across the table. Security camera stills showing Walsh and Hogan handling the unmarked bag before Lena's car was searched. "Care to explain this?" Carter asked, his voice calm but cutting. Walsh's jaw clenched, his bravado crumbling. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We were securing evidence." Carter raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Really? Because these timestamps say otherwise, and we've got audio from Ms. Harris's hidden device. Your little chat about how easy it'd be to frame her? Ring any bells?" Hogan paled, his hands gripping the table's edge. "You can't use that," he stammered. "That's entrapment." Carter's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "No, it's justice, and it's just the start. We've pulled your past cases, dozens of arrests with the same script. All under review now. You're not walking out of here today." Walsh's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. Hogan buried his face in his hands, the weight of their actions crashing down. Their empire of lies built on planted evidence and abused power was collapsing under the scrutiny of truth. In the station's bullpen, Ethan Brooks sat at his desk, his hands still trembling from the whirlwind of the morning. He'd been called into the interrogation room earlier to confirm details about the station's processes, his voice steady despite the heavy glares from Walsh and Hogan. For the first time, he felt the sting of their betrayal, not just to Lena, but to the badge he'd sworn to uphold. As the agents moved through the station, pulling files and interviewing officers, Brooks stood, his resolve hardening. He approached Agent Carter, clearing his throat. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Carter looked at him, his stern expression softening slightly. "Now we clean house," he said. "And you did the right thing, kid. That's not nothing." Brooks nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. He'd been a rookie, unsure of his place, but exposing Walsh and Hogan had given him a purpose he hadn't felt before. He glanced toward the station's entrance, where Lena had stood moments ago, her quiet thank you still echoing in his mind. She'd seen something in him, a spark of courage, and it had changed everything. Lena, now free, lingered near the station's parking lot, watching as Walsh and Hogan were loaded into a federal van. The charges against her had been dropped, the planted drugs exposed as the fraud they were. Agent Carter approached her, his folder of reports tucked under his arm. "We've got what we need," he said, his tone professional but warm. "Your work here is done." Lena nodded, her composure unbroken. "Make sure it sticks," she said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity. Carter smiled faintly. "It will." As Lena walked away, the weight of the past few days began to lift, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. She'd exposed a rot that had festered in Dayton's police force, and though the fight wasn't over, she'd struck a blow for justice. The station buzzed with murmurs as officers grappled with the fallout, some stunned, others defensive, all aware that nothing would be the same. In the days that followed, the scandal erupted across Dayton. News outlets ran headlines like, "Corrupt Cops Exposed, FBI Cracks Down in Dayton," with footage of Walsh and Hogan in cuffs playing on repeat. The department faced a massive overhaul, with internal investigations uncovering more officers tied to similar schemes. Resignations piled up as the higher-ups scrambled to save face. Brooks, now a whistleblower, navigated a mix of praise and resentment from his colleagues, but he held his head high, knowing he'd chosen the right path. A week later, Lena met Brooks at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The hum of conversation and clinking dishes, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd endured. Brooks fidgeted with his coffee cup, his eyes searching hers. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, his voice low. Lena raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You earned this," she said. "Not many would have done what you did." Brooks looked down, his expression conflicted. I just, I couldn't keep pretending it was okay. But it feels like it's not enough. The department's still a mess, and there are more like Walsh and Hogan out there. It's enough for the people they hurt," Lena replied firmly. "And it's enough for you. Don't sell that short." Her words eased the tension in his shoulders, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. "What about you?" he asked. "What's next?" Lena leaned back, her gaze distant. "I move on. There's always another fight." As she stood to leave, Brooks watched her go, a newfound respect settling in his chest. Lena Harris wasn't just a survivor. She was a force, a reminder that truth could cut through even the darkest lies. The reckoning had come to Dayton, and its echoes would linger, a testament to the power of one woman's resolve and one rookie's courage. The echoes of Dayton's police scandal reverberated long after Lena Harris slipped back into the shadows, her mission complete, but her impact indelible. The city had been shaken to its core, the arrests of officers Derek Walsh and Paul Hogan igniting a firestorm that exposed a festering rot within the Dayton Police Department. Headlines blazed across every screen, from local news to national outlets. "Dirty cops brought down in Dayton. FBI uncovers corruption." Footage of Walsh and Hogan, their faces grim in handcuffs, played on a relentless loop, a stark reminder of the consequences of their betrayal. Lena's name, by design, stayed out of the spotlight, her CIA team ensuring the focus remained on the systemic failures she'd helped uncover. For her, it wasn't about fame, it was about results, and Dayton was feeling the ripple effects of her quiet victory. In a sterile federal detention center, Walsh and Hogan faced the wreckage of their actions. Stripped of their badges and bravado, they sat across from their lawyers in a windowless interrogation room, the weight of overwhelming evidence crushing their defenses. Charges piled up, falsifying reports, planting evidence, abusing authority in dozens of cases. "This is bad," Hogan muttered, his voice trembling, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "They've got everything. Audio, video, files." Walsh, usually the bolder of the two, sat in silence, his jaw tight. "We fight it," he said finally, but the words were hollow, a desperate grasp at a reality that no longer existed. Their lawyers exchanged grim looks, knowing plea bargains were their only hope against decades behind bars. The empire they'd built on lies had crumbled, and there was no escaping the truth now. Back in Dayton, the police department was a shadow of its former self. Internal investigations unearthed more officers tied to similar schemes, and resignations flooded in as the higher-ups scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The chief of police stood before a sea of cameras, promising transparency and reform. But the damage was done. The public's trust was shattered, and the road to rebuilding would be long. Ethan Brooks, the rookie who dared to speak out, found himself at the heart of it all. Some colleagues shunned him, loyal to the old guard, while others quietly offered support, recognizing the courage it took to break the code of silence. Brooks didn't care about the politics. He'd done what was right, and that was enough. Months later, Lena sat in her sparse apartment, packing a small bag for her next assignment. A dossier lay open on the table, its pages filled with details of a new mission, a new fight. She glanced at it briefly before closing it, her mind already shifting to the road ahead. The phone buzzed, and she picked it up. Agent Michael Carter's voice came through, steady as ever. "Ready for the next one?" he asked. Lena smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with resolve. "Always." She stepped out into the crisp evening air, the door clicking shut behind her. Dayton had been a battle, but it was just one of many. The fight for justice never ended. Not for her, not for the people she protected. But as she disappeared into the night, she carried a quiet satisfaction. Walsh and Hogan were behind bars. Innocent lives had been freed from their lies, and a city was waking up to the power of truth. In the wake of the scandal, Dayton's community rallied for change. Activists and leaders used the exposure as a catalyst, pushing for deeper reforms to ensure no one else would suffer under corrupt hands. Brooks, now a symbol of courage, continued his work at the station, his perspective forever changed by the woman who'd shown him what it meant to stand up. Lena's legacy lived on, not in headlines but in the lives she'd touched, the systems she'd challenged, and the spark of hope she'd ignited. This story of Lena Harris is more than a tale of one woman's triumph. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how deep the lies, the truth will always find a way to shine through. It shows us that courage, whether from a seasoned operative like Lena or a rookie like Brooks, can dismantle even the most entrenched corruption. So what's the lesson here? Never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story moved you, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to catch more gripping stories that inspire and uncover the truth. Your support keeps these tales alive, so let's keep the fight for justice going together.